Yeah, okay. This is bending refractions, tracing the persistence of colonial imagery about Canadian indigenous women. And the center is the tracing the persistence, okay? First of all, I want to thank Mother Earth for gathering us. I'm gonna say it in Quechua, Sulpaki Pachamama, because I am Peruvian. And I also want to thank the Lecumwen speakers, also known as the Songis and Esquimalt First Nation, because I work, live, operate, and research in that land in Vancouver Island. Yeah, I fly all night to be here. I also honor the land of the Hati-Wendat-Nok, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas Nation, because this is their land. Miigwech. A little bit about me. I am a passionate researcher. I work in Vancouver Island, work for the government of British Columbia at the moment. I'm going to try to report myself and see if it works. Okay, I have to go the other way, sorry. Well, like I said, I work for the government of British Columbia, and I am also the Deputy of Research in ITSS Verona, a nation think tank in Italy. This presentation stems from the research I conducted for my master's degrees in King's College London, and it's very dear to my heart. Academic literature, textual documents, media, and different sources have been spoken. The purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to go back for you to notice the structure. The purpose is to shed light on how the perceptions about indigenous women in Canada persist, what is their impact, and how to inform us, society, etc., to dismantle those approaches. So I'm not claiming any innovation, but I'm claiming to be vocal about it. I think the materials I read sort of can come to the similar place that I'm going to discuss today. Okay, so however, it's a bit new to present it in this way, so I anticipate, I want to make apologies if I make any awkward thing, and please feel free to tell me because I need to hear it. This is a transversal view of a historical progression, okay? So at the top is how indigenous women were perceived back in the encounter era when the settlers, British and French, arrived into Canada, and how they were perceived by missionaries from one side and by fur traders and explorers by the other. And in the lower part of the box is how they were portrayed now in the Canadian social fabric. Okay? Imagination encompasses content that fits into a state ideology, media, and culture. Policy is inspired by all this, and all this imagination persists at the very bedrock of society, of culture. Okay? And that imagination at the end turns into the seat of social structure. It's clear, right? Am I being clear? So that imagination ends up pouring at what stems up as our society, our understanding of the world, how we conduct business in a daily basis. So another pathway for that survival was the indisputable platform offered by the church, every Sunday school, and the indigenous residential school, and the day school. So all this imagery, all this state, ideas, ideology, and that funneled and amplified. There was no Facebook back then, but there was worship. And the worship was daily, it was mandatory, it was simply, how can I say, overstating it, right? So that's how it became amplified, or that is how I interpret it was. Societies, what is the, let's say, the perspective of this? Societies of all sorts, including First Nation countries, collectives, small communities, all are built upon what Emile Durkheim called collective representations, which is ideas of foundational function around which all organize each other, right? So we are societies, despite no matter will come, this happens like that. And it's interesting that I'm using a Western terminology and a Western, not exactly perspective, but a Western format to explain let's say, the horrific things that some part of the Western culture did. Well, because this is not only what I understand, what I know, but I think it applies, and it's a bit ironic, right? So we're going to use the same gun against them. So that's something good. So such elements, whether Western-like articulated values in a logical way or holistic or sentiment, they conform the bedrock of our society. So laws, policies, commanding thoughts shape our lives. And so these representations are the seed, the bedrock. So that's let's say, my theoretical framework. This representation became an algorithm. We all know what's an algorithm, right? It's a programming basis. So exactly like an algorithm, they function. They sort of program the basis, the very initial part where all the architecture, all the statements, all the posts, all the tweets, all the lines come up from. And these representations are so deeply ingrained that they become, I like to use this word, of a tectonic presence. And they become so also visible. We don't question them. We will have to dig and dig and dig and start questioning, is this real, is this real? Well, that's why. If you feel it, you see it, you perceive it, more likely it's real, correct? Pierre Bourdieu also helped me to explain something, the concept of social reproduction and cultural reproduction. Right? Society, we learn something and we start repeating, word to mouth, at home, with a friend, with the colleagues, and we start also encoding it in the language that is going to regulate the groups, policies, statements, the way to interpret an event, laws, enforcement practices, the language we use to relate to each other. So, and I recall now what many of you guys have been saying in the last year conference and in this year what I can hear, how the language is important and how many things live in the language, shape in the language, how the language help us to elapse over time, right? To manifest. So Pierre Bourdieu, social production says that the values, the textbooks, the policy, the power distribution becomes sort of layout. And cultural reproduction, also the schools, the content of books, what is approved and who approves it and for what. So that sort of help us see what is the dominant social order. So this is the theory that I think backs my argument, and feel free to preach me out, to flesh me out, no problem, that's over here. So this systemic and question why male settler privilege remain being socially reproduced in Canada, probably over elsewhere too, but we're talking about Canada, underpinning citizen interaction and legitimizes dominant attitudes towards non-hegemonic peoples, meaning people is power. White women, non-white women, and non-white men and non-white women. And in this case, specifically, indigenous women of Canada, and we're going to see why. So education is sort of the catheter that feeds that poison into society's veins. And education, I'm not talking only about the schools, I'm also talking about Sunday school, which was the Facebook of the time, right? Because there was one, right? So currently reinforcing the victim, the image of, like we saw before, of indigenous women as a victim. It's interesting because a victim is sort of a part of the agency, the power, the decision making has to be provided with things. So sort of it's immobilized in a way, right? It's out of the pool of meaning of the peoples that created it. Is sitting and sort of tied into her pain. And that is the image that we see now for the strongest image of Canadian indigenous women currently. And how did that happen?
Because when the settlers initially came, the fur traders, they, I don't want to jump out myself. I'm going to move ahead. Canada prides itself with being a mosaic where everybody is equally valuable, this beautiful place, right? Canadians, we imagine this country like we all are happy, we're better than other countries, etc. We are cohesive, we are a community, we embrace everybody, we have a policy to let people in, help them out, settle, etc. But that doesn't happen with Indigenous women. So despite some progressive policies here and there, at the end Canada is another capitalist country, liberal economy, right? And in a society as this, the membership is allocated over the basis of productivity. So you're a taxpayer, you work, you make money. In that same measure, well, not exactly, but just about, right? The more money you make, the more productive you are to society, your family, etc. You have more power, you have more work, you have more social leverage, and you participate better in the community, and you're even prominent and more respected. To be clear, by wealth we mean taxable assets, household income, property. Being a taxpayer is also a source of pride and entitlement derived from either occupation or inheritance. So either you make the money or you receive it, or a combination, right? Interesting, what happened to those that dispossessed? Consequently, intangible commodities such as security, credibility, and opportunities become coextensive to the privilege that being a productive member of society brings us. But that doesn't happen with Indigenous women. For example, this is a chart from Statistics Canada 2018 reporting that the employment gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous grew concomitantly. Indigenous unemployed rates raised. So Indigenous work less each time. Indigenous people are less than 5% of the Canadian population, roughly more than 1.5 million. So statistics say, we will put a question mark there, but their unemployment rate is 11.6, and non-Indigenous unemployment rate is 7.6. So it's a big jump, it's a big gap, right? So it shouldn't be like that. Actually, Indigenous unemployment rate should be lower. But why is it higher? There's a reason why, for many. This other graph informs that the more the Indigenous women, the more Indigenous you are, the less money you make, and the more you suffer harassment, workplace discrimination, etc. Well, there is also other research called Poor by Numbers that indicate that racialized women earn less than white women, and also Indigenous people, even men, make even less money than white women. So in Canada, the power, the work is divided first by gender and later by color. So white women generally make less than white men, but Indigenous women make even less than that, even Indigenous men less than white women. So race is really a marker of income and privilege, right? So Indigenous women are not taxpayers, ergo neither are they productive members of society. Sadly, the only statistics where Indigenous women are poorly counted, but still counted, are gender-based and hate violence and even crimes. Connected to the dominant imagination about Indigenous women today, this book revisits painful familial and community stories framed on colonial policy and literature that the author consulted. I recommend everybody, this book is wonderful. It just, you may feel it here, but also you're gonna work in here a lot. It is very eye-opening. Michelle Good posits that the social forces that persistently feed the bent refractions about Indigenous women, the images that change, the inaccurate image, are media, government policies, and settlers or charters narratives, which have been transmitted orally. We all have discussed, and we know that the traditions and ideas are transmitted word to mouth, parents, children, friends, family, small circles. What exactly happened to settlers European too? It's just that it's not discussed and it's not the only way. There is an official policy, so the private world is sort of ignored, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Right? So these three, media, government policies, and narratives, interdepend, feed each other in a triad, right? Misogyny and racism, then we've discovered them at the very bedrock of Canada as collective representations. We just see the information there, right? And media is going to showcase those contents conforming with the societal values and perceptions. And the proof is that they will not be portrayed as such in the media if the values were not there to reflect. People will reject those images, right? People will reject, no, indigenous women are not like that. But if people don't reject it, the media keeps producing them and enforcing. So beside the derogatory image of indigenous women as in terms of moral and occupational aspects, the appeal of a victim is a second-band refraction stemming from the systemic and unsolvable disappearance. And with this, I'm looking at the face of the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls in Canada. Okay, now we're going to make the connection to the past. How did this survive? There is a body of literature being produced for the last 50 years from many ethnographers. Most of them are female and some of them are indigenous background. I have just three here. There are few, but we don't have no time. But these three are sort of the pioneers. Eleanor Leacock is American, but she has studied extensively the cases of indigenous communities in Canada, pre-colonial Canada to be very specific. And some of her conclusions are that pre-colonial Canada was structurally diverse. Leadership, entitlement, skills were not fixated. In some groups were blood, let's say leadership was blood fast, but not in all the cases. And many times leadership was skill-based, and leadership was also temporary. And many times women were leaders too. That's something very interesting. Also, indigenous women were core to their community's stability and operation. Because men used to go far to hunt, right? Women stay at home, stay in the community. That's the other thing. The partition of the world that European settlers that came to Canada brought about private, public policy and war family, that didn't exist. It was a continuity, right? It was community, family, and everybody rooted in the land. Whereas in the capitalist vision is state, public, family, private, and family owns the property. And that one family had to have 25 children to work the land. In indigenous communities, mostly, everybody did everything and they separate works and tasks without the gender tension that we still do. So that was something that these ethnographers have discovered. And they have discovered where? Looking at the explorers, the fur traders, and the missionary accounts. Pamela White, for example, found something very interesting. She found a difference between the fur traders and explorer vision and the church and the state or the crown representatives. The first group described women work as hard as men, women have some sexual freedom. This is a different world. State representatives, crown representatives, and church, we're talking about immoral Indians, dirty women, they are like animals. So you see, it's the same object view, but with that moral, derogatory aftertaste, right? And there's a reason for this. Women were at the core of the communities. Women were the center in many ways. And so, attacking the women disarticulate, disbands the stability of the group. And then it was necessary, the biopolitics of putting these new gender roles, that women had to be feminine, delicate, don't speak too much, don't take too much room, eat little, break blocks, and work in the house. Indigenous women make houses. Indigenous women recollect things, make. The fur trade was successful because of the Indian technology that indigenous women brought. Indigenous women made snowshoes for the fur traders, they would have died without all that. Colonization of Canada couldn't have happened without the way indigenous women were instrumentalized. So the fur traders even married them in many cases. Later, rather, all that was disbanded. Why? Because that was the way to finally set the domination of Canada. And Canada, this didn't happen 500 years ago. This started happening 500 years ago, but it still happened until 60 years ago. It was a long process, so this is not ancient history. This is sort of fresh, as fresh as it is as this heart. Sylvia Van Kirk studied all these relationships of fur traders with indigenous women and how the indigenous women contribute and how the indigenous women later give birth to the half-bred or half-blood princesses, which were women that were the nexus between both worlds because they would speak English or French, and also indigenous languages, and they would know the technology of the communities, and they would also know and understand the point of view of the European settlers that came to Canada to soil, the fur trade, and later the agriculture. But all that changed, and Sylvia Van studied that in a beautiful book of hers that is called Tender Ties. I recommend it to it's beautiful. She studied how this policy was changing and changing the social placement and the agency, not privilege, but the participation of women, indigenous women specifically, later Métis, and later benefited the white women. So all this detriment to them benefited white women. And I just want you to read this quickly with me. There is a strange revolution in the manners of the country. Indian women, Indian wives were at one time the vogue. The half-bred supplanted this, and now we have the lovely, tender, exotic. Why? Because a guy from the Hudson Bay Company married a Scottish lady that he imported from Scotland. Just like we have an imported from South America, imported girl from Scotland. So you see that quote encapsulated the psyche of the spirit of that change of policy that cornered indigenous women to the benefit of white ones. And where did the indigenous women went? To indigenous residential day schools. And many of them, although the schools are dismantled, most of them, apparently, women keep disappearing. And this is what we're going to see now. Canadians indigenous women. Okay, where are we? Okay. The Canadian indigenous women reality becomes more relevant to a colonial legacy that is very disheartening. Between 1997 and 2000, the homicide rates of Aboriginal females were almost 7 times higher than those of non-Aboriginal background. And the other chart from this chart from 2014 shows crimes against Aboriginal women declared to police. But we can safely assume that this is smaller than reality, right? Federal officials stats from 2020 reported that big crimes targeting indigenous people more than double, despite underreporting motivated by lack of trust in agencies of government, lack of police, health services, also the lack of respect in report of these crimes. Police itself doesn't have a standard procedure protocol to report it. I search and search for months, a total number, a total account, even if inexact, of the missing and murdered indigenous women in Canada. No result. What I found is a little bit here, a little bit there, by organization, non-profit, indigenous funded organization, or even I say funded by indigenous managed, indigenous spirit organization. There is no official account, and this is even more disheartening. So the invisibilization is simply, how can I say it? I don't want to use one word, but it's simply terrible. It is horrific. So Native Association Women of Canada, for example, reported in 2002, and I want to quote, the lack of standard policies covering whether and or how police track violence experienced by Aboriginal peoples. Some policy agencies, for example the RCMP, do not collect this information at all. How is that possible? The FBI has a centralized information list of things. Why not the RCMP? You can wonder. This is significant as the RCMP covers 75% of the Canadian territory and serves more than 630 Aboriginal communities and unquote. This disappearance remaining consequential due to poor or non-investigation, lack of closure, arguably justified on widespread and prejudicial assumptions, such as those in yellow. We're going to see those in yellow. So they were in a risky life, that she shouldn't have been there, she's a junkie, she's a drunkard, she was in the sex trade. There is literature proving that not even 20% of the indigenous women disappeared in murder are in the sex trade. So why to say that because she was in the sex trade was killed in murder? I remember there was a case of a woman in Nunavut, I believe, that was killed. Her sister was working in the public attorney office, and she started investigating the murder of her sister. She was killed herself. None of them were in the sex trade, none of them were drunkards or junkies. None of them were homeless. They were just indigenous people. That's it. Yet more disheartening. Okay. Now we're going to move to a part that I like better. Well, Mackenzie Stewart from the Georgia University has thoroughly researched the difference of attention paid by media to the death or the violence suffered by white women and indigenous women in the United States. But this applies to Canada too. It's just that no one has done the study yet, but we all know. We all know there is not enough coverage, there is not enough respect, there is not enough attention paid by the media. And there is an intellectual in USA, a professor who calls it the missing white women syndrome. So the over coverage to white women and the lack of coverage, pretty much obliviousness, to indigenous people. It seems risky to advance a connection between authorities' short span to missing and murdered indigenous women and assumptions about their behavior with the cultural legacy of colonial perceptions. However, first, conclusive evidence might only be available if we scan the brains of the people that take the reports, the police that do not take the report, or the media that do not amplify the news, right? Number one. Second, abounding anecdotal accounts of relatives and friends of the missing and murdered indigenous women in Canada and US and other states and former colonies depict how the police dismisses their requests, their claims, and they don't even do their job to investigate. So, you might tell me, Julia, you don't have evidence. Yes, because the evidence doesn't exist. But we can draw lines. Hopefully one day the evidence will be there. Support the claim then while making the question about the ultimate origin, the root cause of such systematic and systemic obliviousness. If we conduct a strategic analysis, which is the part I like better, from a counter-hegemonic lens, where I stand from, I am a counter-hegemonic person using hegemonic concept to explain a horrific situation. Persistently, throughout indigenous societies, women are the heart of the community. The community is the nucleus of the nation as opposed to capitalistic society, as we discussed earlier. Community life beyond family for First Nations is in turn profoundly rooted in the relationship to land, but not as property. It's a spiritual, heart, and familiar relationship to the earth, to the land. It's a different point of view. Ergo, the strong bond between women land and womanhood is foundational to pre-colonial societies in Turtle Island, aka Canada. Much of that has remained stored in oral language, right? All the traditions, the feelings, the concepts, the definitions, the spiritual journeys, the stories are just oral, or mostly oral. Those stories are being rediscovered through books, publications, and other sources, and also through anecdotal accounts, a quote from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report, as recent, chapter 2, details the indigenous views, recalling invisibilized knowledge and the significant societal foundation. This is a collective representation for indigenous communities, and probably is one of the only things, or one of the few things that is cross-cultural to the different communities in Canada, pre-colonial collectives. Because they all have different cosmovisions, cultures, imagery, language. But despite all that diversity, this is one of the things that we can almost say is cross-cultural, is a similar value, equivalent. The necessity to take the land of Turtle Island, exploited at the convenience of the Crown, British and French, not the people, the Crown, in partnership with the church, again, not the people, the church and the states, the crowns, the power groups, like always, the power groups, not the people, right? The necessity to exploit it demanded blanket decisions that would act fast to facilitate all that. Then it comes clearly why to discredit women and the strategic need to impose biopolitics on them as the mean to disarticulate the community. Egalitarian social patterns and their power balance that kept the post-pre-colonial Canada strong, even in the diversity, had to be targeted to incept the new control and power order. The old strategy, European, even Roman, divide et vinci. Therefore, reframing, invisibilizing the world and the image of women became essential and time-sensitive. The two smoking guns of this pre-colonial, this colonial enterprise was the imposition of male authority by Jesuits and the inception of commodities as core, added to the nuclear family as essential to fertilizers. The trinity of patriarchy, ethnicity, and wealth became the collective representation of the nation that was coming over Turtle Island. This pattern is consistent, and persists at the tectonic level of the Canadian culture, driving behaviors, decision-making in autopilot, unless we shall lie on it, criticize it, and work to dismantle it. Racism was the spearhead backbone in the new social order. Now it remains as an algorithm for programming the Canadian culture, like a neural network in artificial intelligence that we see exactly the same way, but without computers, with minds, encoded in the language. And this is preserved in an intergenerational word-to-mouth transmission, and later is amplified in laws, policies, protocols, procedures, etc. All the content of the society. John Porter helped us to understand that with the concept not only of charter groups, but also with the mosaic of privilege, right? The charter groups at the top, indigenous at the very basis, and other communities sometimes funneled on purpose in the middle to oppress more indigenous. Why? Not just because of racism. Racism is the instrument. It's to take dominion of the land because of the resources. That's it. And it still happens now. We see the petroleum companies, all the exploitation of resources, fighting with indigenous communities up to now. So that has not changed. So this pattern was used also in the United States. Heather Cox and other authors talk about it. Settlers in Canada reproduced that patriarchal, heteronormative, and misogynistic Judeo-Christian tradition, interwoven with a doctrine of racial superiority. Their ethnicity was associated with war, with wealth, drawing power concentrated amongst men that are white, Christian, and of European ascent, but specifically British and French, right? And and that still happens. It's inequality enablers in Canada. So, but where does this come from? We can find it in the Doctrine of Discovery, the Royal Declaration of 1663, and the Indian Act. The Doctrine of Discovery, we all know what it is, as a set of papal laws giving power to Europeans, colonizer, to take whatever they found because they are granted by God the ability to say what's what and they're superior. So this is not, I don't believe everybody thought this as true in that moment. I think they invented it to use it as an instrument, or many of them did. This is my personal view, but in any case was the spearhead of the colonial enterprise, the superiority of the white European colonizers. It was a narrative. I like to equate colonization of the world to the largest and most powerful disinformation campaign whose effects still are ongoing. Many people still believe it. So, and that is what the evil we need to dismantle. So there is a quotation here from the book Keeping Promises by Theodore Fane Aldrich about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And I like it a lot because it really is very eloquent. The tension between these conflicting claims over land gave rise to a special relationship which required the Crown to deal honorably with indigenous inhabitants. So they invented that paper to deal honorably, but it was really to coerce the indigenous communities. You do this or you die. So better settle with me and leave. But that was not exactly how it happened either, correct? So we see that literature is coming out, and then it was replaced by the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is still on, has been going in many revamping, has been reshuffled, changed, edited, improved, etc. But it's still on. And it still regulates and would like to keep it. And it says, we are doing this to help indigenous communities in their communities. So again, keeping people aside from inclusion, from a proper integration in the system of the country. And that is the epistemological bias I want to shed light on. Just to not bore you more, my final remarks. Canada's collective representation includes misogyny and racism at its bedrock. Policy, media, and cultural narratives informed by them reinforce each other. Societal membership is conditioned by perceptions of those representations, which in turn function as social organizers, allocating privilege, agency, and credibility. Images about indigenous women function as a rat, precluding their development and full integration. Women are trapped in that rat. Conversely, feeding distrust in government, which, by the way, is something that many provincial governments are trying to fight back. At least the British Columbia one that I work on, it has, I'm not saying because I work there, it's just because I see it. I did research before I started working with the British Columbia government, and I see it. There is a strong policy to try to erode the distrust. Hopefully it will work. Pervasive gender abuse informs long-term trauma, hindering individuals' emotional stability and the functionality of the communities where that people live. And the lack of restoration perpetuates the harm in nations, minds and spirit, threatens economic growth, human capital development, and guarantees the persistence of inequalities. Thank you very much.